Some players enter the NBA with hype, others with doubt, but some enter with something else entirely. Mystery. He wasn't supposed to be here. Born in Cameroon, he didn't pick up a basketball until he was 15. And yet, within a few short years, he looked like the future of the game. 7 feet tall, broad shoulders, soft touch, Olajuwon's footwork with a shooting touch that stretched to the three-point line. A frame built to dominate, and a skill set that shouldn't have been possible. To the Philadelphia 76ers, he wasn't just another draft pick. He was the cornerstone of the process, the franchise savior, the man who would drag a city out of decades of heartbreak and deliver them back to the mountaintop. But almost from the start, something was wrong. The same body that made him unstoppable also betrayed him. Stress fractures, torn ligaments, back issues, endless missed games. Every time he took a step forward, his body dragged him 2 steps back. And yet, when Embiid was healthy, he was unstoppable. For stretches, he wasn't just dominant, he looked like the best player alive. But just as often, he was on the ground. Sometimes from real injuries, sometimes from flops that turned his dominance into controversy, and sometimes from moments where his body simply couldn't keep up with his talent. He was a generational talent trapped in a broken body. A superstar caught between dominance and fragility, brilliance and frustration, triumph and tragedy. This is the story of Joel Embiid, the MVP, the enigma, and perhaps the greatest what-if of his generation. But to understand how Embiid's career became such a paradox, we need to go back to the very beginning. Before the MVPs, before the injuries, before the process ever began. There was a kid in Yaoundé, Cameroon, who wasn't chasing basketball glory at all, but dreaming of soccer pitches and volleyball courts.
He has spent more time on the floor than on his feet, and he is limping as he gets up.
Before he was an MVP, before the process, before Philadelphia ever chanted his name, there was just a kid in Cameroon growing up with strict parents, long school days, and a quiet love for sports. And basketball wasn't even part of the dream. Joel Embiid was born in Yaoundé, Cameroon on March 16, 1994, a country marked by poverty, corruption, and political unrest. It was hardly the place anyone expected the next face of the NBA to emerge. According to the World Food Program, more than half the population lives in poverty, and nearly 40% in severe poverty. USAID reports that almost half of Cameroonian adolescents are out of school, more than 3 times the global average. Amidst those odds, Embiid carved out his own path. In the Players' Tribune, he described grueling 10-hour school days that often stretched late into the night. Discipline and education were non-negotiable in his household. But while academics consumed most of his time, his natural gift for sports was always waiting just beneath the surface. In the early 2000s, during Cameroon's golden age of soccer, Joel Embiid imagined himself on the pitch. He'd sneak out to play with neighborhood kids before his mom came home, hoping not to get caught. His father, meanwhile, pushed him toward volleyball, even picturing Joel one day on the national team. For years, volleyball seemed like his path. He played seriously, with the idea that maybe one day he'd head to Europe and play professionally. But by the time he was 15, Embiid was already 6'9", still growing, still impossibly coordinated for his size. And while volleyball was his father's dream, basketball was quietly calling. In the gym where he practiced spikes and serves, the hoops that lined the walls kept daring him to try. Sometimes he'd grab a volleyball, carry it over, and toss it at the basket, just to see if it would go in. Then came the spark. In 2009, he watched the NBA Finals, Kobe and Pau Gasol battling Dwight Howard's Magic. The energy, the movement, the athleticism, it flipped a switch. I had never seen anything like that, Embiid recalled. The way they moved, the athleticism, I thought it was the coolest thing in the world. I had that moment like, I just want to do that. Not long after, Embiid found a rundown hoop nearby and started playing regularly. Every shot was punctuated with a shout, "Kobe!" His wrist frozen in the air, just like the hero he had seen on TV. Though Embiid lived a relatively comfortable life compared to much of the poverty around him, his future was uncertain. His parents, Thomas and Christine, envisioned him moving to France to study at the National Institute of Sport and Physical Education, with the hope he might one day join Cameroon's national volleyball team, a sport his family knew well. But Joel resisted. His father turned to his brother Yaoundé, who had played amateur basketball in the Ivory Coast and done some coaching. Yaoundé wasn't an expert, but when he saw his 6'7" nephew with volleyball training and natural coordination, he knew basketball might be the better path. He thought of an old friend, Joe Tuomu, one of the rare bridges between Cameroon's cracked courts and America's elite gyms. Tuomu had grown up with Thomas and Yaoundé before leaving for Georgetown on a basketball scholarship, becoming the first Cameroonian to play Division I basketball. He later scouted for the Indiana Pacers, giving him the perfect perspective to explain what basketball could offer Joel. After seeing photos of Joel standing in a doorway to emphasize his height, Tuomu flew to Cameroon. He arrived at the Embiid home with a gym bag full of leftover camp gear, jerseys, shorts, and a size 16 pair of sneakers. While Joel waited upstairs, Tuomu sat with Thomas and Christine in the living room, making his pitch. Thomas was skeptical. Joel is stubborn. Christine worried. All he wants to do is play sports. He needs to focus on school, Tuomu countered. Basketball can get him into the best schools. He pointed to Ruben Boumje, the first Cameroonian in the NBA, and Luc Mbah-a-Moute, who had also earned a U.S. scholarship. Slowly, the idea began to sink in. 2 days later, he returned. This time, Joel sat in on the conversation, listening quietly as his parents agreed. He could play, but only if he stayed committed to academics. Joel tried to hide his excitement, but inside, he was ready. By February, Thomas signed the paperwork allowing Joel to join a local team led by coach Guy Mudio. Mudio gave him a tape of Hakeem Olajuwon to study and used a medicine ball to build his strength. Joel was raw, still learning the basics, but his feel for the game impressed Mudio. Word of his potential spread to Francois Niam, a former French pro with Cameroonian roots and cousin of Luc Mbah-a-Moute. Together, Niam and Mbah-a-Moute were starting a basketball camp in Cameroon, with the top 5 players earning invitations to Basketball Without Borders, the NBA's global program. But the opportunity came with challenges. Embiid had only just begun learning the game, so Coach Guy Mudio trained him intensively for 3 months leading up to the camp, pushing him to sharpen his skills as quickly as possible. When the camp finally arrived, Joel earned an invite, but nerves took over. Intimidated by the talent around him, he skipped the first day entirely, staying home to play video games with his younger brother. The next morning, Mudio refused to let fear get in the way. He showed up at the Embiid house and personally dragged Joel to the gym. At first, he looked out of place. He couldn't catch a basketball, dribble, or anything, Niam recalled. But like Mudio, Niam and Mbah-a-Moute were struck by how quickly he learned. You could show him something completely new, and he'd pick it up after like 3 tries, Niam said. At the camp, Joel Embiid caught the eye of Luc Richard Mbah-a-Moute, an NBA starter who had led UCLA to consecutive Final Fours under Ben Howland and, like Embiid, was a native of Yaoundé. Mbah-a-Moute saw raw talent and told Joel he could become a special player if he truly committed to basketball. That belief only grew stronger after one unforgettable play. Embiid caught a wild pass in the post, steadied himself, and unleashed a move straight out of Hakeem Olajuwon's playbook. A quick dribble, a drop step past his defender, and an explosive finish at the rim. Mbah-a-Moute was stunned. He later admitted he knew NBA players who couldn't pull off that move. Impressed, camp organizers invited Joel Embiid to Basketball Without Borders, where he once again flashed his raw potential. His performance convinced Luc Mbah-a-Moute and Francois Niam that it was time for the next step. moving to the United States to fully immerse himself in basketball. They arranged for him to enroll as a junior at Montverde Academy in Florida, Mbah a Moute's alma mater, and one of the top high school programs in the country. For Joel, it meant leaving everything behind. At the airport, his younger brother was heartbroken, unsure when he would see him again. But Embiid understood he had to go. This was his chance at a better life, not just for himself, but for his family. That September, his parents, Thomas and Christine, drove him to Yaoundé Insamalan International Airport. Joel was nervous yet excited, speaking very little English but fully aware of the opportunity ahead. When Joel Embiid arrived at Montverde, he didn't know a word of English beyond good morning. He picked it up by listening to comedians and rappers, but language wasn't his only challenge. On the court, he looked completely lost, fumbling passes, struggling to dribble, even missing easy layups. His teammates mocked him constantly, and he felt out of place. At the beginning, it was kind of difficult for me because it was so physical, Embiid recalled. Back home, it wasn't the same. At Montverde, we had really good players like Dakari Johnson, more than 5 pros on the team. That's how I got better, playing against them every day. But it was hard at the beginning. His coach, Kevin Boyle, saw what others couldn't. "You laugh now," Boyle told the team, "but in 5 years, you're all going to Joel to borrow money because he's going to be rich." At first, Embiid had no scholarship offers. "I was just like, if anybody recruits me, I'll go there and try to get my degree," he said. But that summer, he joined the AAU circuit and quickly impressed scouts. Offers began to pour in. With guidance from his mentor Luc Mbah a Moute, Embiid started studying NCAA games and gravitated toward Kansas, a program famous for producing elite big men. Luc told me, "That school is for bigs. They'll develop you there. They get bigs to the NBA." Within a year, the same kid who couldn't catch a pass was turning heads with his size, agility, and surprisingly polished footwork. His rise accelerated after transferring to the Rock School in Gainesville, where he earned more playing time and climbed the recruiting rankings. What started as 0 offers quickly snowballed into interest from major programs like Florida, Texas, and Virginia. But Kansas stood above the rest. Assistant coach Norm Roberts, who had ties to the Rock, brought Bill Self to see Embiid play. It didn't take long for the Jayhawks to make their move. By the end of his senior year, Embiid was a consensus 5-star prospect, ranked among the top recruits in the nation, a meteoric rise for someone who had only been playing organized basketball for 2 years. By the time Joel Embiid committed to Kansas, his rise was already one of the most improbable stories in high school basketball. Just 2 years earlier, he had been a volleyball player in Cameroon who couldn't catch a pass. Now, he was headed to Lawrence, joining one of the most hyped recruiting classes in the country. The spotlight wasn't on him, though. That belonged to Andrew Wiggins, the #1 player in the nation, a Canadian phenom touted as the best prospect since LeBron James. Alongside Wiggins were Wayne Selden, a 5-star guard, and Frank Mason, an under-the-radar point guard who would eventually carve out his own NBA career. For most people, Embiid was a supporting character in Kansas's loaded class. That anonymity worked in his favor. Without the weight of expectation, Embiid was free to grow at his own pace. And what Bill Self and his staff saw in practices quickly shifted the narrative. The raw kid with shaky hands was now showing footwork that reminded coaches of Hakeem Olajuwon, along with a natural feel for rim protection that couldn't be taught. "He's got it," Self told reporters. "He just doesn't know how to do it yet." It didn't take long for Embiid's flashes to show up in real games. In December, against New Mexico, he posted 18 points, 6 rebounds, and 4 blocks, overwhelming defenders with his length and timing. A few weeks later, he dominated Oklahoma State with 13 points, 11 rebounds, and 8 blocks, going head-to-head with Marcus Smart and holding his own against one of the toughest teams in the country. By mid-season, scouts weren't just talking about Wiggins. They were marveling at the 7-footer who had only been playing organized basketball for 3 years. His agility, footwork, and defensive instincts made him look like the kind of player you could build a franchise around.
But just as Embiid's star was exploding, his body gave out. In March, a stress fracture in his back sidelined him for both the Big 12 and NCAA tournaments. Without him, Kansas, once a legitimate title favorite, fell in the round of 32. The injury cast doubt on his future, but it didn't erase the impression he had made. His numbers at Kansas were modest: 11.2 points, 8 rebounds, and 2.6 blocks per game. Yet the impact went far beyond the stat sheet. With him on the floor, Kansas looked every bit like a championship team. He flashed Olajuwon-like footwork, the fluidity of his soccer roots, and the hours he had spent studying Hakeem's game on film. On defense, he anchored the paint, deterring anyone from daring to attack the rim. In just one season, Embiid had gone from an unknown project to the projected #1 pick in the 2014 NBA draft, even ahead of his superstar teammate, Andrew Wiggins. For a kid who once had no scholarship offers, the leap was almost unthinkable. By 2014, the Philadelphia 76ers had a plan. It wasn't pretty, it wasn't safe, but it was bold. Lose now, win later. Stockpile draft picks, develop stars, and trust that patience would build a contender. The strategy had a name: the process.
If you ask me, I'll continue to talk about we should try to keep our end goal in mind, which is to build a championship caliber team in Philly.
And at the center of that gamble was a 7-footer from Cameroon. On talent alone, Joel Embiid could have gone first overall. He was that good. But there was a problem, a big one. In the weeks before the draft, doctors discovered a stress fracture in the navicular bone of his right foot, one of the worst injuries a big man can have. It wasn't just a crack. The navicular is a tiny bone in the midfoot that bears enormous weight. If it doesn't heal properly, careers end early. And it wasn't his only red flag. Embiid had already missed the NCAA tournament with a bad back. Scouts whispered about his durability, wondering if his body could hold up to an 82-game season. Suddenly, the prospect who once looked like the next Hakeem was viewed as a gamble. Comparisons shifted to Sam Bowie and Greg Oden, gifted big men whose careers were derailed by injuries. The Cleveland Cavaliers passed, the Milwaukee Bucks passed, and with the third pick, the Philadelphia 76ers rolled the dice.
The Philadelphia 76ers select Joel Embiid.
For the Sixers, this wasn't just another draft choice. It was a commitment to their radical philosophy. If Embiid stayed healthy, they'd built their franchise around a generational big man. If he didn't, the entire process might collapse before it ever began. At first, the worst fears came true. Embiid sat out his entire rookie season. Then, a setback in rehab led to a second surgery on the same foot. He missed a second full year. 2 full seasons gone before he ever played a game. Critics called it hopeless. Fans questioned whether he would ever put on a Sixers jersey. But the organization doubled down. Better to wait for greatness than settle for mediocrity. And Embiid wasn't the only piece of the puzzle. The Sixers kept swinging for stars in the draft, adding Ben Simmons with the #1 pick in 2016 and Markelle Fultz with the #1 pick in 2017. On paper, the process had delivered a super team core: Embiid, Simmons, and Fultz, 3 lottery talents who could define the next decade. At least, that was the plan. After 2 full years on the sidelines, fans weren't sure if Joel Embiid would ever play a real NBA game. By the time he finally stepped on the floor in October 2016, it felt less like a debut and more like a miracle.
To see this young man play as they hope that now some of their young stars can stay healthy.
And right away, he showed why the Sixers waited. In just 25 minutes a night, Embiid looked unstoppable. Drop steps, fadeaways, deep threes, defensive timing that made the rim feel off limits. He wasn't just good, he was electric. Sixers fans, starved for hope, clung to every moment. They chanted, "Trust the process" from the stands, and Embiid embraced it, making the phrase his personal mantra. But there was always a catch. The Sixers kept him on a strict minutes restriction. No back-to-backs. Constant monitoring of his feet and back. Still, the flashes were undeniable. In just 31 games, Embiid averaged over 20 points, nearly 8 rebounds, and 2.5 blocks, all while playing fewer than 26 minutes per game. He hit step-back threes, swatted shots into the crowd, and carried himself like a superstar in the making. For the first time in years, Philadelphia believed again. The process finally had a face. But then, it happened again. In March 2017, Embiid was shut down with a torn meniscus in his left knee. Another surgery, another season cut short. The cruel pattern had begun. When Embiid was on the floor, he looked like the future of the NBA. When he wasn't, the Sixers were left wondering if the gamble would ever truly pay off. Starting with the 2017-18 season, Joel Embiid was no longer a question mark. He was the answer. Though he didn't play a full 82-game season, when he was on the floor, he looked like the most dominant player in the league, a true two-way force. On offense, he was unguardable, a 7-footer with soft touch, punishing footwork, and the rare ability to step out and drain a three. On defense, he anchored the paint, swatting shots, erasing drives, and forcing opponents to think twice about even entering the lane. By 2021, Embiid had put together a season worthy of MVP consideration, averaging nearly 29 points and 11 rebounds while leading the Sixers to the #1 seed in the East. For stretches, he wasn't just dominant, he looked like the best player in the world. But year after year, the story was the same. Injuries, a torn meniscus in the playoffs, fractured orbital bones that left him wearing a mask, hand injuries, back spasms. It seemed his body was always fighting him at the worst possible time. Still, he kept coming back. And in 2023, after years of close calls, Joel Embiid finally captured the NBA MVP award, the first Sixer to do it since Allen Iverson. He led the league in scoring for a second straight year, averaging 33 points a night while still anchoring one of the league's top defenses. If one game defined that season, it was January 2023 against Nikola Jokic and the Denver Nuggets. For years, Jokic had been the measuring stick, the back-to-back MVP, the rival big man who embodied everything Embiid was being compared against. That night, Embiid went off. 47 points, 18 rebounds, 5 assists, 3 steals, and 2 blocks. He outplayed Jokic in every way, dominating both ends of the floor and reminding the league that when healthy, he could be the best player alive. It was the culmination of everything the process promised. The gamble had worked. The Sixers had their superstar, and Embiid had his validation. But even then, questions lingered. Could he translate that regular season dominance in the playoff glory? Or would his body, once again, betray him when it mattered most? For all of Joel Embiid's dominance, there was always a shadow trailing him, the shadow of injury. From the moment he stepped into the league, Embiid's career was a balancing act between brilliance and fragility. And no matter how high he climbed, his body always seemed to pull him back down. In 2018, it was a fractured orbital bone, a freak injury that left him playing the playoffs in a protective mask. In 2019, it was knee tendonitis and a stomach virus that left him visibly drained during the Sixers' postseason run. In 2021, he tore his meniscus and somehow kept playing on it. In 2022, another orbital fracture and a torn thumb ligament. Even in his MVP season of 2023, a sprained LCL in his knee once again limited him in the playoffs. It became a cruel cycle. The Sixers could count on Embiid to dominate the regular season, but once April arrived, they could never count on him being whole. And the timing was always brutal. While other MVPs used the playoffs to build their legacy, Embiid was often sidelined, hobbled, or forced to play through pain. Each year ended the same way, Philadelphia falling short, and the same question echoing across the league. Can Embiid's body hold up when it matters most? That cruel reality is now part of his legacy, a generational talent whose postseason resume still reads like unfinished business. Sixers fans had seen this story before. The heartbreak of Allen Iverson's near misses, the collapse of the process lottery picks around Embiid. And now, even with a dominant big man in his prime, injuries continued to rob the franchise of its best chance at glory. Joel Embiid was a force of nature, capable of scoring 40, grabbing 15 rebounds, and erasing shots at the rim. But just as often, he was on the sideline, wrapped in ice, masked up, limping off, or collapsing to the floor, The NBA had never seen a superstar quite like him, not because of his skill, not because of his size, but because every moment of greatness came with the uneasy question, how long could it last? Joel Embiid wasn't just a dominant big man. He was, and still is, the fragile giant. Joel Embiid is 7 feet tall, nearly 300 pounds, one of the most unstoppable forces the NBA has ever seen. And yet, he spends a lot of time on the floor. Sometimes it's real, the torn ligaments, the orbital fractures, the constant collisions. But other times, it's not. Over the years, Embiid has developed a reputation as one of the league's most notorious floppers. The sight of a man that large crumpling to the hardwood at the slightest bump has become both comedy fodder and controversy. For some, it's strategy. For others, it's weakness, and the receipts are everywhere. Against Marcus Smart, he went flying after minimal contact. Against the New Jersey Nets in the playoffs, he once tumbled so dramatically on a drive that it made highlight reels for all the wrong reasons. And against Clint Capella, Embiid collapsed as if he'd been leveled by a truck when replays showed barely a shove. Clips like these went viral. To some fans, they were proof of Embiid's gamesmanship. To others, they were proof he didn't deserve the respect of a dominant MVP. And that's where the divide begins. To Sixers fans, Embiid is an entertainer, charismatic, funny, larger than life. The guy who trolls opponents on social media, celebrates with dances, and fuels the trust the process cult with his personality as much as his game. But to opponents, he's a villain. They see the cheap shots, the trash talk, the dramatic flops, the antics that feel like humiliation as much as competition. Rivalries piled up. Andre Drummond, once his personal punching bag. Karl Anthony Towns, locked in an on-court brawl. Clint Capella, Russell Westbrook, even entire fan bases, all caught in the orbit of Embiid's chaos. The flopping, the trolling, the theatrics, it all made Embiid polarizing. Yes, he was an MVP. Yes, he was dominant. But he was also the guy who mocked, who baited, who fell to the floor as if gravity worked differently on him. And that combination, unstoppable skill wrapped in controversy, made him one of the most hated and most fascinating players in the league. To some, he was Shaq with a Twitter account. To others, he was a 7-foot actor who cheapened the game. Either way, Joel Embiid had carved out a new role for himself. Not just the star of the process, not just the fragile giant, but the NBA's ultimate villain you couldn't look away from. Joel Embiid's career has always been framed by one question: what if? What if his body had held up? What if the process had delivered the way it was meant to? What if Philadelphia's gamble had actually turned into a dynasty? On paper, the Sixers had the blueprint: a generational big man in Embiid, a playmaking phenom in Ben Simmons, who was hailed as LeBron James 2.0 by the media, a #1 overall pick in Markelle Fultz. Add in veterans like Jimmy Butler and later James Harden, and it looked like the perfect storm. But in reality, it was heartbreak after heartbreak. Fultz's shoulder injury derailed his shooting form before his career ever started. Simmons blossomed into an all-star, but melted under the playoff spotlight, refusing to take shots when the Sixers needed him most. Butler nearly pushed Embiid and the Sixers to the Eastern Conference Finals in 2019, if not for Kawhi Leonard's impossible buzzer beater. But after that heartbreak, Butler clashed with the organization and was shipped out, only to lead Miami to multiple finals runs. Harden's arrival brought hope, but his playoff meltdowns only deepened the disappointment. And through it all, Embiid remained. Dominant, brilliant, but always carrying the weight of what could have been. Even his MVP award couldn't erase the painful truth. Joel Embiid is the only league MVP in NBA history who has never advanced past the conference semifinals. It's a legacy defined as much by absence as by greatness. Because when he's healthy, Embiid is unstoppable. A player capable of 40 points, 15 rebounds, and complete defensive control. But history doesn't remember flashes. It remembers championships. It remembers rings. And so far, the injuries, the collapses, and the missed opportunities have kept him from the one thing that would silence all doubt. Joel Embiid should have been the centerpiece of a Sixers dynasty. Instead, he's the living embodiment of the cruelest what-if in modern NBA history.
Joel Embiid was supposed to be the answer, the cornerstone of the process, the 7-footer who could blend power with grace, footwork with finesse, and size with skill in a way the league had never seen. And in many ways he delivered. An MVP season, 2 scoring titles, nights when he looked like the most dominant force in basketball. But just as often he was betrayed by the one thing he could never control, his body, the injuries, the collapses, the endless cycle of dominance followed by heartbreak. For every 40-point masterpiece, there was another limp to the locker room. For every MVP chant, another playoff run cut short. And that's the paradox of Joel Embiid, a generational talent trapped in a body too fragile to sustain his greatness. A player who inspired hope, frustration, and endless debate, all in equal measure. So what will history remember? The MVP, the flopper, the villain, the entertainer? Or the superstar whose legacy will always be defined by 2 words? What if? This is Joel Embiid's story, the story of a broken body and a generational talent.